Welcome back. We're going to dive right into our session on server-side Google Tag Management. And I'd like to introduce Ben Fisher. Ben is a product manager at Google, and he is extremely passionate about the evolution of tagging, web analytics, and a healthier, privacy-centric internet. We're really lucky to have him here. Anytime Ben speaks, I always learn a lot. And joining Ben is our own Tyler Blatt. Tyler is amazing, and he is a lead analytics engineer here at InfoTrust. He's also a Google Cloud certified cloud architect. So Ben and Tyler, let's take it away. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Pete. I appreciate it. Yeah, that's a great intro and also a good reminder to come off mute. So I appreciate that. How you doing today, Ben?
Good. How are you, Tyler?
Doing
Thanks.
great. Hopefully we get to teach some people a little bit about server-side GTM. I know it's an emerging technology, but with that, let's go ahead and jump into these slides. All right. So the goal today is to just give you an overview of what server-side GTM is, and yeah, here's our agenda. What we want to touch on is at first status. Well, what is server-side tag management? It's a emerging technology. It hasn't been around too long, and some people just might not be quite aware of what even is this thing yet. You're hearing it as a buzzword, but we'll get your heads wrapped around what's going on with this technology, and then kind of immediately following that, what are the pain points? So, why is this technology emerging to begin with? What are the things that maybe don't work well with traditional tag management systems, and how are those being solved? So then we'll jump from there into how is server-side GTM addressing those pain points? So after we talk about what kind of were the holes, how are we going to plug them? Then we'll specifically dive into a little overview of server-side GTM, and then we'll wrap it up with hopefully you're interested by the end of this, and how can I get started? What are the ways that you can get involved with server-side GTM? What might a pilot or a test look like?
Yeah, I think one of the underlying themes throughout is why is the need for this kind of solution accelerating as the browser regulatory ecosystem evolves?
Exactly. Listening to the keynote, there was a couple words that I wanted to pluck out for our settings. There was privacy, control, and disruption were all themes that I was hearing, and it fits well into what we're going to speak on today. We can move on to the next slide. So this section will cover what is server-side GTM. So with that, we can go ahead and jump into the next slide. We're going to cover what is the current state of tagging on client side. So this is an example of client-side tag management where you load on a website and you actually have to reach out for your client-side tag management code, and that will pull in code from each of these platforms. So to say this at a high level, when you are firing a client-side tag manager, you need to download JavaScript from Facebook, from Google Analytics, from Google Ads, and actually execute on all of your customers' computers on the client side. That code is being executed locally and then sending data to those third-party collection platforms. And that's how it works today. So essentially what you're doing is downloading one big JavaScript that's going to download a lot more little pieces of JavaScript, and all of that is being done on your customers' computers. We can go next slide. So this is an example of server-side and how that's different. So one, let's start from very, very high level. The difference between client-side and server-side means whether it's running on your customers' computers or it's running on a computer that's in the cloud. It's somewhere else. It doesn't necessarily need to be in the cloud, but you're consuming a service somewhere else. So no longer is the earnest of this data collection happening on your customer's computer. So the concept of server-side means we are able to stream our event data or our data that we would normally be collecting against customers in some unified format to a server, and from there, that server is able to distribute that to the third party. Which means the earnest of those API calls, that JavaScript running, is no longer on the client side, but it's now been transitioned to a machine that we own, which gives us a little bit more control. We'll talk about the benefits of that later, but also lifts that performance off of the client side and makes it a little bit easier to organize how we're sending that data.
Right. Traditionally, all the tags on the client side, or many of them, send the same data to many different places. But as the page loads, they're going through and making a call to each of those third parties and saying, I want to see a page view, I want to see a conversion, et cetera. And in server-side GTM, it kind of changes the model where there's one data collection kind of tag happening on site and sending all of the data you would need to the server container and then fanning it out from there.
Exactly. Yeah, it's wonderful. One point I haven't made yet, we're going to dive into pain points here in a second. I love questions. I imagine Ben likes questions as well. If you guys have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We may get to them, we may not, but I will always follow up via email and make sure that we get back to anybody that has any questions. The more interesting, the better for me. I like that this is an emerging technology. So if you seem like you have a corner case, I'd love to hear about it. So please feel free to share your thoughts. If you're interested or you're stuck on something, let us know. And I'd love to get back. So we love interactivity here.
Yeah, big plus one. We also know that the level of understanding of this kind of solution and the level of technical sophistication varies dramatically between clients. So please let us know if there are things we are not covering or you want more information on.
Couldn't have said it better myself. That's perfect. With that, we can jump into the next slides. Obviously, this section will be covering what are the pain points, what are the traditional holes that we've seen that have just been something in the tag management world that's been existing for a while, and these are the things that server-side can address. So one of the ones that I see pretty much everywhere, certain industries deal with this a little bit more, is just dealing with how we standardize and scale our systems. So if you think about the concept of what's happening on a web page, is we are collecting metadata on a user, on consented users. We are collecting behavioral data. We have this entire data model that needs to run through a system and be translated into third-party APIs. So figuring out how do we translate each piece of data, how do we make sure this data is uniform, all of these pieces of maintaining all of these different tags and the standardization of them, maybe cross if you have many different sites, if you want to have them under a similar setup, how do you deal with the scale of that parity? So this is an issue that haunts a lot of people that are running tags and have the issues of running multiple environments and keeping uniformity across them.
Yeah, I think Tyler will dive into this a bit later on, but governance is an issue with traditional client-side tagging, not to mention the pain of just maintaining all of the tag configurations to send all the data you want. But another pain point that I think we hear a lot on the Google side is consistency in how you're measuring certain things across your measurement platforms. How do you really compare how Facebook ads is doing against LinkedIn ads if you're configuring to send page views slightly differently, your conversion slightly differently, and things like that? So if it's one standard data model, one standard event stream, you don't have to worry about that.
Exactly. Yep. We can move on to the next slide. Perfect. Thank you so much. So governing what tags are firing is also interesting. So there's a slide that's going to come after this one that really shows this picture that I'm describing, but I want to, at least while it's a little bit simpler, explain the concept. So in this example image, what you're seeing is, your website loaded Google Tag Manager, which loaded Google Ads, which loaded a conversion pixel. Now that's by design. This isn't bad, but it's to show that a tag can fire another tag. So Tag Manager's job, very literally, is to fire other tags, and those tags might fire more tags. And when you're in the world that we're currently living in, where consent is paramount, you need to know where you're sending data, what's firing, what's going on. It's important to know all the possibilities of what's happening on your website so that you can clearly state to your customers, this is what we're collecting, this is the data, this is where we're sending data, this is where it's happening. And in the world of client-side JavaScript, sometimes that's very difficult to execute and understand what's happening.
Yeah, and one thing to note is, like, Google Tag Manager as is has some means of governance of what tags are doing, where they're sending data and things like that, but it is still difficult to manage. And it's a constant process to go and check if you can actually get the data to the new platform that you just onboarded, given your current governance in GTM and things like that. So it's a cumbersome process, to say the least.
Yeah, I think we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is Site C performance. There's one coming up that'll show exactly what I'm talking about with piggybacking, but it's important to this one hits on the subject as well. So every piece of JavaScript that gets fired has to be loaded in. And the best way that I explain this to laymen is, if you think about a highway, each device, each possible device that a user has a limited number of internet connections they can open. Without getting too technical, there's just only so many that can be open at a time. And those are your lanes in your highway. And depending on how much traffic you have to get through those lanes at different times, it can cause your site to load slower. So, and that is shared with loading the images and the actual content of the site. Of the site and videos. So if you have a lot of little tags that need to load all at the same time, they're actually taking up lanes of that highway. And most of the loading time isn't necessarily the downloading, but the communication with the server itself. So the more talking to servers, the more it can slow down your site at crucial times, which has SEO impacts down the road. Yeah. With that, we can go to the next slide and you'll see what I'm saying. So it's a little hard to see. This is piggybacking. This is actually a live scan. So I've cropped out where this came from and you can only see the platform. So this is a real live scan of piggybacking on a customer's website. So I just talked about sharing the highways, which are, they can be between like 8 and 32. But think about how many tags are loading at the exact same time and affecting site speed, all piggybacking off different tags. And you might not be aware that this one tag loaded these other 15 tags that are now all loading on your site, and then you need to be able to say, this is where we're sending data, this is what is happening on the site. It's difficult to govern.
Yeah, I think another avenue to think about here is the user optics of seeing this in a network request in your browser, right?
Yep.
Even though you may be doing everything in a compliant fashion and you're only sending first-party data to these platforms, it does not look like that when you see all these third-party names and calls being made out from your website.
Yeah, if thinking of a non-industry person looking at this, they're like, where did you send my data? This is many places. That's an extremely valid point. We can go next slide. So this one, I imagine most people know, but it's just something to bring up in case you're unaware. And for those of you that aren't aware, I will keep this extremely high level just to understand. This is the concept of a third-party cookie call. And what it essentially is a way for a third-party platform to store identification for on an individual website of who this user is and to be able to share that amongst other third parties. There's ways of chaining it. And it's essentially one of the central functions on how advertising has been able to ID users, and this technology will soon be deprecated. So, and a lot of the tags from your tag management systems are using this technology and rely on this technology to some degree today. So this is when we talked about, we'll talk about control. Obviously, we talked a little bit about privacy, but this is the disruption piece where I said, pull that word out of the keynote. This is disruption that's happening right now that affects the current status quo of advertising that exists if you're running regular TMS today. And there are ways that server-side can help address this problem.
Yeah, I think where server-side plays in is helping with graceful degradation, right? We know you want to retain the value of certain conversion measurement that uses third-party cookies while you can, but what happens when they disappear and your client-side tags stop working?
Exactly. Yeah, this is an interesting one, and I want to preface a stance that I have on this. If a user intends to block JavaScript, I think it should be blocked. So that if a user wants to, they have control of what happens on their browser, and that's very important. Now, so you should have the consent of users before you collect their data. This is in no way a way to get around consent, but there are ad blocker softwares or things that will inherently block ways of collecting data, and it can be a problem when the user doesn't necessarily intend on blocking data for that site. They've consented. They said, go ahead and collect this. We want you to advertise to us. We want to have a relationship with you. You've gone through all the proper avenues, but they're also, an aware customer that's in this current ecosystem, and they just have an ad blocker installed because they don't trust the people that they don't opt into, and they don't realize it's stopping your communication with them. Can go on to the next slide. Meanwhile, I want to remind everybody, any questions at any time, I absolutely love fielding them. This world gets more and more complicated. You can put a number of lenses on almost any of these subjects. There's privacy lenses, there's governance lenses, there's scalability lenses, there's first-party data strategy downstream, that is durability lenses. There's so many different ways you can look at these platforms that, it's the questions are always welcome. It's wonderful. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Just bear with us for a second, guys. I guess in the meantime, I have there's a slide that I was planning on getting to later, but oh, it looks like we're back up. Never mind. We'll pivot. We will get to that slide later. Yeah, so this is an interesting use case. So what's happening currently is we talked about silos. That was another keyword that you could pick out of the keynote. So, and Ben touched on this a little bit where he was saying, you have your data models that you're sending that Facebook might look at something different than Google Ads might look at them. And then you have different definitions. This is what a page view is. This is what a screen view is. These are all your definitions everywhere. So with the data being collected in its own interpreted way and being distributed across third parties, it's oftentimes for a marketer, like, how do I make my decisions? I jump to this platform, I jump to this platform. It's hard for them to see everything in one place. And that's a common problem that I see across the industry.
And that becomes more and more important as you need to, say, federate some of the signals that you send to different places, right? If you have to think about what can Facebook accept versus Google accept versus can go into my BigQuery database, right? And doing that over and over again, it's really challenging versus seeing one data stream saying, I know that I can't send this form of personal data to this place. Let's cut it out at the source, and then you are good to go and fan your data out.
Yep, exactly. Okay, we can go next slide. So those are a subset of the problems. I wouldn't say that's all the problems that have gone in TMS, but it's a subset that we're going to talk about today. And now we're going to go into specifically how server-side GTM can help address these problems. So this is a visual example of how we're moving the tagging collection to the server. So I showed our product, the InfoTrust product tag inspector scan on the left. So this is a scan of a customer site where all these tags are firing on the client's computer. We talked about how those network connections can compound and make it hard for the site to load in specific times when they're all kind of bottlenecked. On the other side, so versus on the server side example, the only things happening client side are the server side TMS event stream. I will say with a caveat, some tags do still need at least once to be fired client side, but it is much more limited, and as much as possible will take place after client side tags have fired and completely on the server side part of that transaction. So we talked about security and data governance as well. So JavaScript piggybacking is complicated. I showed how crazy that big slide can get, where we're sending data to, where it's getting chained to, what tag might piggyback. Sometimes unintended JavaScript ends up on a page. The absolute beauty of what's going on inside the server-side environments is we control the event stream, we control what's data's in there, what shouldn't be there, what can get sent to places, and we also control exactly where we're sending it. So we know this is when we send it. So I think a lot of people sleep on this feature. When you think of like CCPA, and you have to get what you've sent, get what you've collected on people, and then possibly delete it. When you're sending data through server-side GTM, you can keep a ledger of all of that. You know exactly where you sent it, on what days, and to where, and it becomes much, much easier to execute these requests for compliance. So it's a lot better.
Yeah, and two other things I'll hammer home here is the transparency aspect. I think with client-side tags, you have to trust that the tag is doing what it says it is. You have to trust that the Facebook tag is hashing data prior to sending it to Facebook. In server-side GTM, you can use the debug feature to see the actual raw data that is being sent out from the server in the request, and you can confirm yourself that there's no data being sent out that shouldn't. Yep. The other piece that we're really excited about is we already have some features that can do this, and we're introducing more, is the ability to augment or redact data at scale. And so imagine that you want to make sure you don't send an IP address to any third parties in certain scenarios, or you want to actually enrich a margin value from a website with profit instead before passing it. Those are all things that you can and will be able to do in server-side GTM in real time. And you can do that once, right? You can set up these rules to condition what you do and don't want to pass certain parties, and then you're good to go.
Absolutely amazing. One more thing that I'd like to touch on too here, which is just a cool feature that you could not get with client side. if you're collecting your own raw data event stream and dropping in something like BigQuery and an API goes down, you are limited to the ability to communicate with that API afterwards. So if that API won't accept time in the past, you are limited to that API's functionality, but you'll control your own data to be able to send back to that platform at a later date if the API went down. Right now, from a client side perspective, you cannot do that. The data is just gone, so we just have a hole in our tracking. But as long as your server side container stays up and BigQuery, which is pretty much always up, or you can still continue to collect that data, and you won't have holes in your data, at least in your first party set, which is another huge piece that happens a lot with customers. Oh, I forgot to add the tag, I couldn't get this in, this API went down, now we have holes in our data. It's a way to lean into first party and get around that issue.
It's a great point.
So this is a little bit linked to the last one that I talked about. I was a penetration tester and like security guy in a previous life for a little bit of time, and I could not believe when I first stepped into the marketing world that these tagging containers were just injecting code onto the site. Now it's a standard and it's okay, and we do it in a safe manner, but there's a reason your IT team and your development team are freaking out when you try to go around a release and when to deploy a tag on a Friday, and you're like, hey, if I don't get this floodlight out, we're not going to have any tracking on these. But how often do I see people living this life where we need to get these tags put in, but that's a real site change and it could bring down site functionality and it's just a headache. So what you're doing with server-side tag management, you still need to treat those containers with reverence. I'm not saying to go in and do whatever you want, but it's a little less scary because you're never going to stop transactions from happening on the site when you interact with the server-side container. So it's a little bit safer when you get those down to the clock decisions to be able to interact with them.
Yeah, and that goes back to your point before, Tyler, right? You have more flexibility as to what you pass to anywhere, but you can make sure that you're always collecting it for yourself in a first party context and then decide some of the things later on, right? Where in the client side context, the event happened and either you captured it or you didn't.
Yep, exactly. So we've touched on this a little bit, but this is so we've already kind of beaten this one into you guys, but it's important to reiterate the ability to collect your own first party narrative. So I've also been suggesting people something new that I haven't said is think about your event stream data model that's going to go into your server side container. And how you would like that to be interpreted into a first-party data set. Because it exists well in its raw, but it's also very intelligent to separate that into, this is my anonymized data set. This is my data set of known users. These are the pieces so that if somebody gets, chooses to be deleted, they do a CCPA request, you have to get rid of the data, your anonymized data set's never going to change. You can continue to operate and interface with that exactly how you have been. And then when you want to have that one-to-one targeted relationship with consented users, that set is also interpreted in its own way and continues to operate as it should. And this first-party data collection machine is what allows you to think that way.
Yeah, that goes towards our earlier point, Tyler, of like the graceful degradation.
Yep.
Regardless of how like the regulatory bodies and compliance evolves, right? You can still collect your consented anonymized user data that will never change, and then you can figure out what you can fan out from there.
Exactly. So this is an interesting one. It's not always super important, but I talked about the one, it's nice to have your tags firing from the optics perspective, like Ben said earlier, coming from your own. You're collecting first party data and you're collecting it at your own URL. That optics is nice, as well as people that don't intend to block your first party data collection will no longer do that because you're collecting it at your own URL. It doesn't appear to be going somewhere else. They understand this data is being collected by you and being processed by you, whom they've decided to trust with their consent.
Yeah, so just to be clear, how this works is when you set up your server container, you can deploy it on any cloud or on-prem provider, but you can host it on your own domain. So if your website domain is abc.com, your server container will be hosted on abc.com. And you're also able to actually load your client-side Google scripts from your own server container. So when someone's looking in the network request tab on your website, it doesn't say you have this script loading from gtm.com or google.com. It'll say you have a script loading from abc.com, which is your website. So kind of really honing on the first party context from a optics side, but also from a really making it first party.
So I would talk a little bit about this, but I think I might throw to Ben to walk through this because it's a fairly new feature, and I think he knows it much better than I do.
Yep.
But the point of this slide was to talk about how you could use before this new feature come out, how we could use other systems to essentially enhance the data as it's flowing through server-side GTM. And with that, I will take a step back and let you address this one, Ben.
Yeah, so something we're really excited about on the Google side is making it easier for our advertisers to pass rich data that's not available on their website to Google and other third parties to help with bidding and modeling and reporting. So an example would be I'm an e-commerce brand and I sell a product on my site, and I normally would just send the revenue value to Google or to Facebook or to whoever it may be. But what I really care about, what I really want to optimize for, is the profit for that product SKU. And so how would I do this? And right now, the way that it's done is you send a client-side ping directly to whatever third party you want to send it to. Then you also have to supplement that data by writing just an API. And it's asynchronous, it's offline, it's a lot of work, and it's not in real time, which is one of the important pieces. And so what you can now do with server-side GTM, and we released this about a week ago, is you can in real time pull data from some of your first-party data sets into the server container to append to hits that are going to any of these destinations. So an example would be, I have someone come to my website and purchase a pair of running shoes, and I send the product SKU and the margin of those running shoes, and the value of the running shoes to my server container. I then go and do a lookup on product SKU in my Firestore database, or you can integrate between Firestore and other databases too, so it doesn't have to be Firestore. And then I send back what the actual profit margin is on that pair of shoes and send both of those to Google to immediately be used in bidding optimization. So it's pretty exciting. It helps our real-time models, helps on the reporting side, whatever platform you use, and it makes sure that you can get all of the rich signals to wherever you want in real time.
And with that, it looks like Ben and I have been talking a little bit too much. So we are at time. Pete will be hopping in to talk to us in a second. In the meantime, there's a question from the audience. I don't know that I have the best answer for this, and maybe we'll ask offline or answer this offline. The Phil Pierce was asking, does server-side GTM allow you to get around content security policy? Which I don't imagine it would necessarily get around that. I think you should, but if you're loading from your own domain, they would be weird to be blocking your own domain from downloading from itself. So in that perspective, I would say, yes, you should be authorized to interact with your own domain, but any other type of like third-party loading should still go through your CSP the way that it normally would, and would continue to operate the same way. Nor would I advise any kind of trickery in that space. I imagine there's an honesty to a customer that's interfacing with your CSP and saying, I give you consent, and now you're loading from your own authorized URL. But outside of that, there wouldn't be anything that changes in the traditional way, at least from my understanding of this. It would continue to operate as is.
That's 100% correct, Heather.
It's good to hear.
Excellent. Ben and Tyler, thank you so much for unpacking that. There's a very dense topic, and I found it very entertaining and useful. And thank you again.